Jesus. Welcome to another edition of EverybodyHatesCleveland.com, the podcast. My name is Jim Pete from EverybodyHatesCleveland.com. Joining me, as always, is my podcasting partner, Michael Hattery. Michael, how are you doing tonight? I'm going to act as though we didn't just finish a podcast on the Cleveland Cavaliers. I am going to act as though I am happy, and I'm smiling, and I am glad to be alive.
Yes, I have not indeed seen you at any point earlier in this evening, and I am excited for this opportunity to discuss Indians things separate from any Cavs emotions that I may have.
I am not going to discuss anything involving the Cavs, and I'm going to be happy because we are going to be talking about today, kind of kicking off our preseason coverage for the Cleveland Indians. We're going to jump right into the minor leagues, as a matter of fact, and we're going to talk about some players for the Cleveland Indians who, quite honestly, could impact the team this year. The Indians, as of right now, haven't made a whole lot of big splash moves. They brought in Mike Napoli to play first base and to DH. They brought in Rajai Davis to play somewhere out in the outfield, likely eventually center, but probably in left to start. But last year, our most impactful player turned out to be a guy who came up from the minors, who we have been waiting for years and years, and that's Francisco Lindor. And while even though we have some really good prospects and waiting in the wings, I don't know that we have another Lindor in the system. But this year, it does appear that the Indians are looking internally for potential gap fillers from the minor league system or potential free agent signings, low-cost free agent signings, I might add. But Mike and I are going to take a look at some of these guys today, not all of them. We're going to try to keep this podcast within a small amount of time, which we're not very good at doing, but we're going to give it a shot. I guess where we're going to start this off today, Mike, is I'm going to lob the ball to you. Is there one guy that you see either in Columbus or maybe even Akron who could play a major role with this team, in particular based upon a couple of holes that we may have in the outfield, potentially a hole at third base, depending on how far along you think Giovanni Rochella is. Is there a guy on this roster who you think is going to force their way on this team and become impactful at some point in 2016?
Is it super lame if I say a bullpen arm? Because I'm going to say that I think Sean Armstrong could have the biggest impact on this team, and that's not because there are other guys who can improve the team. It's because I think Sean Armstrong could really lock down the eighth inning, and that'd be a pretty big deal, adding him to McAllister and Shaw.
Well, and I think Sean Armstrong has been an interesting case over the years because obviously whenever you talk bullpen with the Indians, the first guy you think of is Cody Allen. Allen, who flew through the system in a year, basically tap danced through Carolina with 2 appearances, maybe 3, I can't remember now off the top of my head. But Armstrong's biggest comparison over the years has been to Cody Allen. I think that's kind of been unfair to the kid. Obviously, most players don't fly through the system, especially Cleveland system, with that speed. They seasoned Armstrong a lot more. I made some appearances last year, looked pretty good. Where do you see him, Mike? Is he a back end guy? Are we going to see him setting up next year, or is this a guy who needs another year?
I'll let you speak to this as much as I can. I can do a couple inputs. I think that unlike Austin Adams, Armstrong has stuff that actually plays up. I think he has, he sits in the mid-90s, can push it up there. His fastball isn't straight like Austin Adams, which is a big first step. Seems to have decent secondary arsenal. So I think he can play up to the back end. I think we could see him in the 7th or 8th inning by the middle of the season, possibly sooner. I worry a lot about Brian Shaw. I think McAllister can kind of take a step forward in the bullpen, but I think there's a pretty good chance we're going to be kind of fixing the Shaw position sooner rather than later. So I think that he could succeed. I think he could be outstanding in the 7th or 8th, and I think it'll likely happen.
Well, and you mentioned Brian Shaw, and I mean, I go back and forth with the kid. Brian Shaw not being a kid, I go back and forth with him from year to year, and I've never really been a big fan. And I guess, my hope with a guy like Sean Armstrong, and, here's obviously a guy that I've seen quite a bit over the years in Carolina and beyond. I actually saw him pitch for East Carolina when he played there as well. I mean, this is a kid, I think, over the years who has disappointed in a sense that, again, people thought that a couple of years ago that he was ready to launch himself to the bigs. That didn't happen. He struggled at the tail end of, I want to say 2013, might have been 2014, and found himself last year, was fairly dominant last year, and again made his way up to Cleveland. He's got the kind of stuff that plays in that 8th inning and 7th inning. And the nice thing about having Cody Allen, maybe for you and me, Mike, we prefer a guy like Cody Allen to be kind of malleable, moving him up and down. But since he is the closer, and since it's clear Francona is going to use him as such, this does open the door for Armstrong to kind of bully his way up. I'd rather see him take the job away from Shaw, or perhaps Shaw have another good season in which these two guys can kind of move around the tail end of games in a setup sort of way. I think he's got the stuff, and I think they actually have handled him pretty well. You talked about it yourself. I mean, this is a kid who's kind of got it all. He's got velocity. He's got movement. He's had the type of seasoning where I think, to me, he's starting with this team, and I think, to me, he may earn the right to pitch in the 7th or 8th. I'm just not sure what Francona is going to do with that. So I do agree with you. I think Armstrong is a guy right now who's probably the clear-cut favorite to be impactful. I guess maybe as we kind of tail away from him, you talk about velocity. This is a guy who can touch 99. He's got really, he's got a good cutter. He's got a good curve. Is this a guy that Francona trusts to put in the 7th and 8th, or are we going to see Francona be Francona and not do it because he likes Shaw so much?
Oh, Terry.
And we eventually are going to have to tackle Terry Francona. Today is not the day, but is Armstrong going to be allowed to be a late inning guy this year?
I think so. I think the one thing that Terry Francona is willing to sort of oscillate in usage on is his bullpen. I think that when guys are successful, he does a pretty good ability of mixing and matching with guys in the right situations. So I trust him to do that. There are other things I don't trust him to use well, but I think that also, just on a plain usage basis, Francona uses the heck out of his arms. So whether he wants to or not, he's probably going to end up using Armstrong a lot. So I'm going to rely on that. But I don't know. I think he'll trust him enough.
Yeah, the key for me with Armstrong is very simple. If he's healthy, his velocity stays up. And if his velocity stays up with the movement that he has with that cutter, he could be dominant. I mean, I love him as a potential replacement for Cody Allen should they decide to move Cody Allen at some point, or should Cody Allen get hurt. So I do agree with you. I think Sean Armstrong is a guy that we could see. He could be, a guy who balances our bullpen. I've not felt balanced with our bullpen in a couple of years. So it will be nice to see another elite arm, and he is certainly that in a bullpen sense. I think he hit the nail on the head. Moving away from, I think we're going to come back to the rotation in a minute. There are a couple of interesting guys that I think might play a part in this year's rotation, especially if we have injury issues at some point or another, which we likely will. But I'm going to move to the outfield. A name that comes up, has been coming up for probably the past year or two, is Tyler Naquin. And I just want to preface this. I think the offensive defensive side of Sean Armstrong is Tyler Naquin, based simply upon the fact that there's opportunity. They did bring in a bunch of guys to play in the outfield, but Naquin's a guy I think that some people in the front office like for some of his intangibles. I think Naquin's a guy who can be impactful in that he has some interesting skills. There's nothing that screams elite to me about him play. However, since I've seen him play, there's been a lot of scuttlebutt about improvement. He does seem to have some IQ in that. He has improved over the past couple of seasons pretty steadfastly offensively and seemingly defensively too. We hear about the gun. I'm not too impressed with coverage. I'm not too impressed with first step, but there does seem to be improvement there. Do you see Naquin as being a guy who can make an impact on this team in 2016, Mike? Or did you see these little moves that they made, bringing in a Cowgill, bringing in Rajai Davis, as the Indians front office saying, Naquin's just not the guy?
Yeah, I think there's a pretty strong case in terms of signaling that that the Indians don't love the idea of starting with Naquin, which, considering he was drafted as a junior, he's taken a while to get through. He's in his mid-20s. I mean, for guys like Naquin, now has to be the time in terms of his big league career. So I think signaling-wise, you struck at it. It's not great. I buy into him as having league average upside, and that is the most boring sounding frickin' thing in the world, isn't it? That is so boring.
God, would we have taken that with Michael Bourne though? I mean, and I'm not sure that's the team we have, but when you look at some of our outfield candidates, Mike, league average potential sounds like a friggin' gold mine to me this year, at least to start the year off.
That's where I was going to sneak to, but you took it out of my hands. You're just so much quicker to the punch than I am.
What can I tell you? I mean, since we haven't talked in so long, since that Cavs podcast many moons ago.
It's true. But what I was going to say was, I think the Indians are in this situation where their issues are not adding impact players, and adding impact players would be nice. Their issues are they have Lindor, they have Gomes, they have Kipnis, they have Brantley. These are 4 impact position players. And so you have your impact talent. What you need to do is hide the holes. And so league average in center field sounds really nice. And league average at third base is really nice because those are significant upgrades of positions of need. So for me, league average sounds really nice, but the upside of league average sounds less nice. And I like Naquin, but everybody I've talked to, you who've had a lot of eyeballs on him, can't really sell me on him being anything better than average defensively. He strikes out a pretty decent amount, which kind of hurts his offensive value, and he doesn't get a lot of power for his strikeout frequency. So there's good contact quality, but the strikeout rate with the sort of lack of power and lack of base running value and league average defense, I think the likelihood of a league average player, I think it's in there, but I think it's 30 or 40%, which is not a lot of optimism for making this team better.
All right. Well, I had to throw his name out there. There does seem to be opportunity, and you never know when a guy grabs that opportunity. I will come back to the offense or to the outfield again. There are a couple of guys that I'm sure if the people that are listening to this will want us to be talking about, and that's Clint Frazier, and of course, probably the guy a little bit closer, Bradley Zimmer. I don't want to get there now. There is one other guy. This could be the guy, Mike, dependent on what happens over the next month, depending on what happens in spring training, and with regards to the health of one Giovanni Rochella. This is a guy I think that has been under the radar for the past year and a half. Us minor league beatniks have been paying close attention to him for a couple of reasons, and that's one Yandy Diaz, third baseman from Cuba, who made his debut 2 years ago with Carolina, got hurt right out of the gate, and then came back, had a fantastic finish to that year, and moved his way all the way up to AAA Columbus. Will start the year off in Columbus this year. Has a really interesting offensive tool. Seems to play above average defense. I think was rated the #1 third baseman in the minor league system last year. So I ask you, Mike, is Yandy Diaz a guy minus power, but is he a guy who could, you talked about league average in the outfield. Is this a guy who could add a bit of offense, less power, but could come up and perhaps if Giovanni Rochella struggles, could be a guy we see balance third base.
Yandy, I mean, he is someone who is so interesting to me, and I think it's because I've heard and kind of seen so much variance in terms of that defensive grade. I think he's someone where if he's average to above average, that's really positive, and that's what it sounds like. I think more recent grades have seen him be, like you said. I think Baseball America called him the best third baseman in his league last year, which is all
right.
really positive. And I think he was. I don't know if he was better than Ursula, but he's. Some have said he's in the same ballpark. I don't know. Ursula seems so exquisite to me defensively that I'd be curious, but I guess the offensive profile is really interesting. He's someone who has a tremendous eye at the plate. His walk rate generally has exceeded his strikeout rate, which is very rare. But it's paired with very below average power, especially for third base. And one of the really interesting things that happens, I think, when you have someone who doesn't have a lot of power but has traditionally high walk rates in the minors, they're going to get the zone pounded at the big league level. And so they're going to have to go through this sort of transition where if they want to retain their walk rate or if it's going to be an above average tool, they're going to have to prove that they can, sort of hit the ball for extra bases. They're going to have to prove that they have at least an average power tool to sort of protect their base on ball tool. And, I think the next year or so, we're going to see whether he's going to be able to do that. Some people are really optimistic about it, but, I really just can't. I don't know enough about his mechanics, and I don't know enough, but I'm very optimistic that the plate discipline is really exceptional and generally is a pretty positive indicator for big league success.
Well, the thing about it too is with the Indians, Mike, over the years, I think the proof has always been in the pudding with regards to how they handle a player to what they think. We talk a lot about J-Ram, and while J-Ram has, discussing him has been dependent on when you talk about him has been part real, part jokey, because J-Ram is such a larger than life player with the way he acts. I think that the Indians handled him in a way that showed us that they had a lot of belief in him, and have since he's panned out to some extent, not panned out to some extent, depending on what year, depending on what month you look at. But I think the way they're handling Andy Diaz, they started him off in Carolina. He was there briefly. He played in less than 80 games that year because of that injury on opening day. And immediately moved him up to Akron. And like I said, September, he was in Columbus. So are the Indians showing us how they feel about him, or is he just another guy that they're just kind of plugging in at Columbus as kind of a fill guy? I mean, I don't get that impression, age-wise or talent-wise. I mean, are they showing us that they believe in him? And we're talking about a guy, Mike, who's 6'2". When I stood next to him, when I met him, opening day prior to the game, I mean, he's a biggish guy. He's lanky, but there does seem to be power potential there. I mean, I honestly don't see it. I don't think that's the way he swings the bat. I don't think this is even a Brantley kind of power guy, but there does seem to be some potential there. But are the Indians, is Chris Antonetti in that front office saying to us, look at this guy? I mean, this is a guy we're moving up quickly in a similar fashion to Jose Ramirez.
I think he definitely has priority. It definitely seems like he does. I guess my sort of other issue with that is he was 23-24 last year in Akron.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Which, I think that he has to sort of be moved quickly at this point. I think I do think there's a potential for him to be up a lot earlier this season than people think. The Indians have been pretty active in terms of looking at third base. They've talked to Uribe. There have been rumors about them talking to Freese. They were in on the Frazier deal. So I think the Indians are less confident in starting the season with an Ursula, Jose Ramirez sort of split time plus Jose utility than people think. I don't think they're in love with Urshela starting the season at third base because they've been pretty proactive about addressing it or attempting to address it so far this offseason.
Well, and that's what initially Mike and I were planning on addressing positions, but I do think there's still some play out there with some guys whose price tag may be falling. So we're going to hold off on that over the next couple of weeks to see what happens, in particular with the outfield and third base, as potentially some other moves. Mike, starting rotation, seems pretty set. We don't need to talk about guys like Carlos Carrasco, guys like Corey Kluber, guys like Danny Salazar. Obviously, those are our big three. Obviously, the Indians have high thoughts on them, as they didn't get moved this offseason, as we speculated earlier in an earlier podcast. Past them, you've got Cody Anderson, who seems to have locked up that number 4 spot. You've got Trevor Bauer, you've got Josh Tomlin, you've got TJ House. It does seem like this rotation is big and bulky right now. There are some intriguing names in Columbus, though. We've got Clevenger sitting there, who apparently a lot of interest across the league. He's a guy who I honestly, I don't know a lot about Clevenger, in that I haven't seen him up live and in person. But this is a guy that clearly a lot of people who I respect think highly of. Is Clevenger a guy who is thought highly enough that, being where he was at the end of last year, that his natural move is to come up to the big league club as a starter ahead of some of these guys? Or is he there this year to gain seasoning and hold out unless there's an injury or a potential trade down the line? Or might they bring Clevenger up at some point as a bullpen arm, knowing that eventually he's going to be a starter?
I think that's a really interesting suggestion that I like a lot. Clevenger to me seems like someone whose upside and stock is high enough that he's a guy that they're going to focus on getting issues at AAA, but he's sort of, when they bring him up, he's there to stay. He's not a spot start solution. He's a legit rotation candidate in the long term. I think that's kind of, what his upside is, and perhaps where they value his stock. But there is so much in between him in the starting rotation, and not just so much in terms of fluff, so much in terms of guys who have gotten it done at the big league level, and maybe on the outside looking in. With Anderson's option left, and I think they're out of options on Tomlin and Bauer. Either Tomlin will go into the bullpen as a loogie, not a loogie, I apologize, as a long man, or I think Anderson might be pushed out of this rotation. And honestly, I think we differ, but I am in love with TJ House. I think he's an exceptional arm when he's healthy. And I think he could add a lot to this rotation as a lefty. And I think he's an absolutely phenomenal starter, and I'm a big fan of House. So they have so much depth in terms of really competent big league pitching that Clevenger's sitting there at 8 and Plutko at 9, both being guys who are pretty close to ready. That I think it's possible we see them, but there is so much rotation depth for the Indians to work with.
Well, see, and this is, we do actually agree on TJ House. This is I think I see his ceiling. I don't know. I think actually, Mike, we probably see his ceiling is the same. You sold me, I think the big thing with TJ House with regards to me is, over the past 2 years, not over the past 2 years, but 2 years prior to coming up to the big leagues, he really developed into a guy who could let me put it to you this way. If he can keep the ball on the ground with this defense, the way it's stacking up, he could be very effective. I think you wrote a piece about it. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but did you not write a piece about that very thing a couple years ago? Maybe not a couple of years ago, maybe last year.
It's kind of the Anderson and House positivity thing with me, but anybody for the Indians who can get over 50% ground balls is going to have a really good chance at having success. If they have low walk rates and over 50% ground balls, you're going to have a really good chance at being a really good pitcher.
Well, and House
can do that.
That's why he was successful. When he was getting tagged in Carolina for 3 years, mind you, 3 years. This was a guy they thought highly of, but couldn't push through. He had velocity. He couldn't keep the ball down. If you want to know what changed, well, he got a lot more healthy. He got a lot more fit. But he figured out how to keep the ball down in the zone. That's what changed. The only thing that stopped him last year, Mike, was injury. Let's be real. So, we could almost look at TJ House as a minor league guy. This is a guy who played half a year with the big league club, so it could be him and not Clevenger. Going back to Clevenger, though, I think the thing that people miss with him is you're looking at a guy who, This is the guy, to me, and you're going to have to bear with me here, and I know we're over our 20 minutes, but to me, he's what we hoped Zach McAllister would become. He throws in that 96, 97 mile per hour range, except he has plus slider. He has a potential plus curveball. He seems to be a workhorse in the same form or fashion as Zach McAllister. And he seems to have the same type of makeup. He just has more than one pitch, more than two pitches. Is this kind of the finished model of what we thought Zach McAllister was going to be a couple of years ago?
It's tremendous. I agree. I think that's what Clevenger can be, and that's a really good pitcher. I just think that the Indians are in a position where I buy into House's ceiling as above league average, and he's a potential 5-starter, 4-starter, 5-starter. I think Clevenger can be better than league average. I don't buy into that for Bauer and Tomlin, but I think they can stabilize you at the front end. So, this back end of the Indians rotation is going to be really, really solid. And I think instead of watching Bruce Chen and Sean Markham make 5 to 7 starts this year, you're going to be seeing those starts going to a lot better quality pitching, which at the margins improves your roster.
Well, and I mean, I'm not going to get into Plutko because love that cat. I mean, we've got the rotate. I don't know that we're going to see any. The best part about this, Mike, I don't know that we're going to see any of them. And I am intrigued with Clevenger potentially being a guy in the bullpen if he can't force his way into this rotation. And again, we've got Plutko sitting there who is very, very, very interesting to me. We'll get into him at another point. We're going to wrap things up, but I do want to talk about two more guys. I don't really want to spend a lot of time on these two because I don't know that we're necessarily going to see both. We may see one. We may see both. Who knows? It depends on what they do, I think, this year. I think there's one that the Indians want to season a little bit more. Of course, I mentioned Bradley Zimmer, and I mentioned Clint Frazier. Mike, obviously, I'm just going to throw this out there. Of the two, Bradley Zimmer is more likely to make an appearance this year, correct?
Yeah, I think he's I would put his odds at like 45%, 50%. He makes a show. I think if Zimmer's in the big leagues, it's a sign that he's become like a superstar prospect. I think everything he has to have, to me, a pretty absurd season for them to pull the trigger on him, which would be great. But I would say that probably like 10% odds. What would you say?
I never want to say 0, so I'm not. But I would say single digit. I'll go 9% just to be close to 10. I've seen okay, let me put it to you this way, Mike. Even had he have excelled in Double-A last year, I don't know that we would have seen him this year. Being that he struggled and that he's starting the year off in Akron leads me to believe that they see him as more than a year away. I think the dream scenario is to have him come up by August. I think the reality of the situation is that if he doesn't rake in Akron, and even if he does, we may not see him based upon the simple fact that the Indians just don't do that. Now, he's not Francisco Lindor in that he's older, that it's more realistic for him to come up. I just think that we are a spring training away from seeing him. I think we're at 9%, and I only say 9% because you never know what's going to happen with this outfield. Our outfield is in that scenario. I'm going to be honest with you, Mike. I like Clint Frazier better. I don't really have a sensible reason why. When I see growth like I saw with Clint Frazier from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, I see a kid who is young. I see a kid like Lindor who seems to have the ears of the scouts. There's a lot of people paying attention to what he's learning and what he's living with. I really think Frazier's the better player. I just don't think we're going to see either one of them in the outfield patrolling for the Indians next year. I think we have too many Naquins in their way who Terry Francona will utilize first. Now, can they force their way onto this team? You bet. And that's kind of what we hope. as kind of a last call here, Mike, is there anybody out there that we're forgetting about that you can think of off the top of your head? Maybe maybe a guy like Jesus Aguilar comes up. I don't know. Is there somebody, maybe a James Ramsey? Is there a guy out there who may make an appearance who might make a difference? I don't know why those two names pop into my head. I almost apologize.
I guess maybe Jeff Johnson, who's a reliever in Akron. If I have to read one more piece about why Jesus Aguilar isn't getting a shot in the big league level, I swear I'll rip him to shreds. I just don't have time for that anymore. It's a joke.
Oh, well, I do think I think that we are Francisco Lindor uncapped a lid off of a prospect system that's getting tasty. You mentioned Plutko, you mentioned Clevenger. We got some rotational arm. What about a guy like Kaminsky, and a guy like Sheffield, who 2 years from now we're going to be talking about Pandora's box that Lindor opened in 2015. So I don't know that 2016 is going to be splashy or flashy. I do think we have some very interesting depth options who could barge their way into this lineup and be something special, basically because we have some holes that could allow it to happen. So we shall see. I think 2017 is the year where we're going to see some guys make some impactful entrances. Mike, I'm calling it here. Our next topic of discussion, for those of you who care about such things, in the next week or so, Mike and I are going to tackle a subject that should be volatile, to say the least. That's right. Mike and I are going to talk about Terry Francona and what he means to this club in 2016. I'm going to be honest with you, Mike. He's the biggest impact on this club next year because he's got to make some changes. And if he doesn't, it might not matter who we bring in.
That's a great close. I'm done.
All right. On that note, go Cleveland. Hey, you want to talk some Cavs? Nah, neither did I.